"For the record," Nicky said, his normally high voice pitched low, "this is a terrible idea." The four had hit the street just after the streetlights came on, and as they rode, all of them kept their eyes peeled for blue and white lights. Dakota had pulled a hooded sweatshirt out of his closet, and Nicky had thought similar. His was green, but at least it was dark green. George, on the other hand, was in a denim jacket with slacks, for some reason. He was going to stand out like a sore thumb when the lights hit him, and it was communally agreed that if anyone was spotted, they would scatter. Crystal had gone for jeans and a gray t-shirt, and as Dakota sweated in his hoodie, he wished he'd gone the same route. Her blonde hair was in a tail and pulled under her cap, and they were traveling by streetlights alone. "Noted," Crystal hissed, but she didn't slow in the least bit. "So what's the plan?" Dakota whispered, his face shadowed as they moved between the lights. "Ride around, look for suspicious vehicles, see what we can see." "That's it?" he said incredulously. "Terrible idea," Nicky said again. "Well, I don't see any of you guys coming up with better ones," she blurted out. "All the snatchings happen after sunset, so between 8 and 10 seems to be our best time to go searching." She and George had formulated that plan earlier, Nicky and Dakota interjecting tidbits here and there. "In all the snatchings, the kids have been taken after sunset," George had said, showing them instances with potential times. "No one ever goes missing during the daytime, at least not that we can tell, and the disappearances peter off after summer, usually starting in the spring again." Crystal nodded, tapping the map of the 5 closest neighborhoods. The map was overlaid with the plastic cover for the pet disappearances and the abductions of the children. Once you put it together like that, it was hard to argue that the 5 blocks around the residential area weren't the kidnapper's usual stomping ground. "That tells me that the snatcher is taking advantages of times when the kids will be out past dark, or when they're likely to be alone. If we go carefully around just after sunset, then maybe we can see someone cruising for kids, or at least spot something the police have missed." That was how they'd come to be in the park around 3 o'clock, eating a picnic lunch and watching the traffic. It was right beside the library, and the playground there was one that the boys had played on often when they were younger. Heck, they had been playing on it the day before Chris had gotten snatched, and they couldn't help but watch the tykes that played there now. Any one of them could be taken tonight. Any one of them could be the next victim of the snatcher. What if it's not a person?" Nicky put in, turning Dakota away from the kids who had been squabbling over some game of tag. "What do you mean?" George said. "Of course it's a person. Kids don't just disappear out of nowhere. Not kids barely even in middle school." Nicky had been trying to be helpful lately, clearly noticing that they weren't just going to let this drop. He wasn't enjoying the game, but Nicky realized that unless he wanted to sit at home by himself, then he was part of this too. They all were, for better or worse, and this case had kind of consumed their lives for the past week and a half. "Yeah, but what if it's a spirit or something? We haven't explored that. I mean, we're looking for a guy in a van or something. What if..." He leaned down to whisper the next part like he didn't dare say it out loud. "What if it's the ghost of Harold Shelby?" Dakota rolled his eyes. "Oh, come off it." "You know they say he roams the neighborhood at night," Nicky said, raising his hands defensively. "That's just schoolyard talk," George said. They all knew that George had the same opinion of ghosts as Ebenezer Scrooge, and considered that they were more gravy, or wishful thinking, than grave about them. "You mean the guy who used to own the Shelby place?" Crystal asked. "Yeah," Nicky said. "My dad told me that when he was a kid, the Shelbys still lived there. There was Harold, his wife, and his son, Harold Jr. They say that Shelby Sr. was into some weird stuff. He was a kind of zoologist or something. Liked to study different snakes and reptiles and things." "Herpetologist," George put in. "No, like a snake researcher. I didn't say anything about herpes. No, I mean... Oh, forget it." Anyway, Dad said that Shelby Sr. hated kids. Didn't even much care for his own son, and he was constantly running them off the sidewalk in front of his house or yelling at kids who came up to sell stuff. Dad was actually friends with his son, Harold Jr., and he said he went in there a few times to see him. Dad told me that there were all kinds of snakes and species of reptiles in the house, especially in the basement. His old man used to, breed different specimens or something. And Dad said he had a bunch of them. He only got to look around a few times because when Harold Sr. caught them in the basement one day, he told my dad he better never catch him in the house again. Harold Jr. came to school the next day with bruises, and Dad said it was pretty common knowledge that he beat his wife, too. That's awful and all, but I still don't see how that has anything to do with ghosts, Dakota said. I'm getting to that. Well, when his wife finally got the strength to leave him, she took Harold Jr. and divorced him, moving away to live with her parents a couple of towns over. They say after that, Shelby became a real butt, yelling at kids and running them off with a golf club. They said he beat some girl and put her in the hospital, but he had enough money to pay his way out of it. Dad told me that when he was in high school, some of the kids broke some of his downstairs windows. Said he maybe threw a rock or two himself, and the boards had been put up since then. When Shelby died, not long after beating that girl up, it wasn't much of a surprise to anyone. Some say her father did it. Some say it was her brothers. Some say one of his snakes just didn't like how he was being handled. But the whole neighborhood breathed a sigh of relief without crazy Harold Shelby roaming around. The state came in and took all of his snakes for research purposes, but I heard he had some real freaks in there. People say they covered some of them with tarps, but they were huge, and some of them were pretty mean. So, George said, we all know Shelby was a real piece of work. So, Nikki said, so why wouldn't he come back as a ghost? Shelby didn't like anybody, his own family included. It's not a stretch that he'd feel like his life's work was unfinished. He'd be a vengeful old spook who lures kids in and makes them pay for, I don't know, trespassing or just existing or something. Good theory, George said, but you forgot that the disappearances didn't start till about 5 years after Shelby died. What was he doing for all that time? Catching up on his correspondences? Nikki shrugged. I don't know, it was just a thought. George and Nikki went back and forth about ghosts a little more, Crystal just shaking her head at them as Dakota scanned the vehicles around the park. It could be any one of them. Any one of those vehicles could hold whoever they were looking for. What about you? Any other theories on who the Snatcher is? Crystal asked. It would honestly be easier if it was just a ghost, Dakota said, watching a white panel van as it pulled over to ask a mother and her daughter something. If it was a ghost, then you could just sprinkle holy water on it or say some Hail Marys and make it go away. More like it's some guy who likes to hurt kids, and that's scarier than any ghost. People are harder to get rid of with some words and a dousing of water. They cleaned up not long after and started aimlessly riding their bikes around Culver. They were still riding as the sun sank beneath the trees and the insects began to tune up. Okay, Crystal said. Now we can start. It's been an hour, Nikki said at 9 o'clock. How much longer are we going to do this? Just a little longer, Crystal said, moving her head about fretfully. We need a plan, Dakota began, but then hissed as he saw the front of a white car at the end of the block. Hide, he growled, thinking it might be a cop car. They swerved into a ditch, their shoes now full of muddy water, as the car pulled lazily into view, turning out to be someone's hatchback. As it left, they all sighed in relief and started rolling again. Come on, Nikki said, slapping at a mosquito. If we were going to find something, we'd have found it already. Let's head back. Not yet. Just a little longer, Crystal said. But as they passed Piney Road, the chuff of her brakes made them stop. There was a dark-colored car parked in front of one of the houses, and somebody was in it. The lights were off, but the engine was still purring away. Through the fisheye window on the back, you could see the hazy shadows of two people moving in the back of the car. It was hard to tell from here, but they looked like they might be tussling, the car shaking ever so slightly now and again with their efforts. Let's get a closer look, Crystal breathed, and the four of them came quickly towards the car. The closer they got, the more they could see the smeary back window, and the less they liked it. Was this the Snatcher they had been looking for, as he took another kid? What are we going to do if it turns out to be our guy? Dakota asked. Put our lights on him, I guess. Startle him. Get a good look at him. Maybe give whoever he has time to get away. Get ourselves grabbed too, Nikki hissed. There's 5 of us, including whoever's in that car, Crystal put in. I think we can hold off one adult long enough for some of us to get away and call the cops. "I'll get his license plate number, just in case he speeds off," George said, and they all nodded, thinking that was a pretty good idea. They laid their bikes on the sidewalk and approached on foot. They could get them easily if they needed to, and as George bent down to write the license plate, the other three snuck up to the back door. The car was definitely jouncing some, and as they moved into position, Dakota thought he heard that song again. Hall and Oates were once again trying to warn him off something, but he began to hope that maybe it was a sign. Perhaps the duo was trying to lead them on to something, and he hoped it wasn't too dangerous. As he pulled the door open and shone their light into the car, Dakota turned his head as the song blasted out onto the street. What it had led them to was something different. "What the hell, kid?" yelled a guy who was only about 4 years older than him tops and had no business calling anyone kid. He and the girl in the back seat looked like deer trapped in headlights, and they had startled them in the middle of something that was far from a kidnapping. The boy was naked to the waist, the girl's top open to reveal her white bra. They could see now why the windows had been so smeary, and as he slammed the door shut, all three of them beat a hasty retreat before the boy could give chase. They had grabbed their bikes and were preparing to scat just as a different light hit them, and when the blue and whites flipped on, they mounted their bikes and beat a hasty retreat. 45 minutes later, and after a lot of riding and huffing and cutting through people's backyards and side yards, the four of them sat at the edge of the grass lot and caught their breath. It was 10:15, and when Nikki suggested they pack it in, it was decided in favor of. Decided on, but not unanimously agreed to. "Come on, guys," Crystal huffed, out of breath but not deterred. Just a little bit longer." Nikki slapped a bug off his cheek, not for the first time that night, and George was a panting mess as the underarms of his jacket bled darkly with sweat. Nikki looked at Crystal as if he had something he really wanted to say, but Dakota rode over the start of his sarcastic response. "If we were going to see something, we'd have seen it by now. No one's been grabbed this late, at least not that we're aware of. At this point, we're just tempting fate." Crystal couldn't argue with that, and as the four turned for home, they were forced to call the night a bust. Now they were heading home with nothing to show for their efforts but sore legs and sweaty clothes. "I told you this was a bad idea," Nikki complained as they pedaled for home. "It was an idea," Dakota said. "Whether it was bad or not is up for debate. If you wanted a slumber party," he said, turning to Crystal, "you could have just said so. We could have been in your garage playing Super Nintendo this whole time, taking turns on Mario Bros. Or something. We didn't have to come all the way out here just to hang out." Crystal looked away, and as she passed beneath the streetlights, Dakota could see her eyes were a little shiny. "Lay off, Nick." She thought that what she was doing would help. They were turning down their own block now, but Nikki was far from done. "Yeah, I know," said Nikki, his usual good humor running short. "That's what we all thought we were doing out here. But we've done nothing but scare the crap out of a couple of high school kids that'll probably want to kick our butts the next time they see us. All we've been doing for the last couple of weeks is sticking our noses where they don't belong. After tonight, can we maybe get back to doing some normal things? Because I'm a little tired of..." Whatever it was that Nikki was tired of, they would never know. He came up abruptly short as the front tire of his bike hit something, and he went flying over his handlebars, skipping across the pavement like a hockey puck. The others skidded to a halt, Nikki already moaning and gripping his leg, but whatever he had hit, they had missed. He'd been at the extreme right of their formation, and as they went to help him, they heard a harsh rasp of something as it slid across the asphalt. George had gone down to help Nikki, trying to see how bad it was, and Dakota was halfway to his side when he heard Crystal make a strange noise. It was like a scream pushed through a wet hose, and he turned around as her hand slipped shakily into his. He saw it behind them, its body rising as it spat out a harsh sound like an angry wasp. It was huge, its body rising nearly 9 to 10 feet into the air, and it had a dark hood around its head that opened like a sail. Dakota wanted to reach for his flashlight, wanted to see what this shadowy creature was, but he was frozen under the gaze of those piss-yellow eyes. Nikki was gibbering now, and Dakota thought it had nothing to do with his leg. George was still fussing over him, trying to figure out what was injured, but when Nicky turned his head, he suddenly saw what had grabbed their attention and loosed a loud scream to the night. Whatever it was, it left them then, heading towards the shadowy hulk that lay beyond one of the few street lamps that didn't work, straight towards the old Shelby place. "What?" Nicky began, gulping as he tried to bring moisture back to his mouth. "What in the hell was that?" I don't know," Dakota whispered, but as the lights from a nearby living room caught his eye when they winked to life, he realized they had to get out of the road. "Come on," he said, helping George lift Nicky as he pulled him towards Crystal's house. The garage door opened smoothly, and as they sat him on the ratty sofa, George sucked in a harsh breath. Nicky's toes were facing his other foot. "His ankle's broken," George whispered, as Nicky sucked in a painful little breath now that he was stationary. "I don't know why you're bothering to whisper," Nicky panted. "My ears work just fine." "We need to get him to a hospital," George said, and Dakota nodded, realizing this was all going to end very badly. They'd have to explain why they'd been riding bikes at nearly 11 o'clock at night in the first place, and all four of them were likely going to be grounded until school started. As Nicky put the back of his hand to his mouth to stop from sobbing, however, Dakota realized that his friend was worth the trouble, and they couldn't leave him like this. "Okay. Crystal, where's your..." But when Dakota turned, he realized that Crystal wasn't with them. Looking back to the street, all he saw was the pile of bikes they had left in the road as well. He started to panic for a half second, but then he looked to the shapeless mass 2 houses down and knew where he would find her. She was more like Chris than any of them could have known, and she had chased her answers all the way to the last place he wanted to go. "You're still here. I thought you might be. Thanks for joining me for tonight's story. If your insatiable appetite for horror knows no bounds, might I suggest one of our playlists, or one of our previous stories in the archive? There should be one appearing at the end of the story any minute now. And of course, if you're not subscribed, why not go ahead and hit that subscribe button? Maybe hit that notification bell so you don't miss any of the spooky things that we do here. If you prefer your horror a little more analog, you can always pick up one of my books. There's a link below to my latest, and it'll take you to all the great things that I've posted on Amazon. For my book lovers in the audience, I always suggest coming on down to Patreon so you can become part of my ghostly reader tier and get a book anytime I write one, which is usually about twice a year. Speaking of my patrons, let's go ahead and thank them, shall we? Thanks to Unicorn Hollow for being our spooky ghost contributor. Thanks to Janet and Lady Vengeance for being our spooky skeleton tier contributors. Thanks to Hi Stacy, Winter, Xaronan, Emily Coltsfoot, Stephanie Carrington, Marianne Schuler, Tyler Parker, and Jennifer Damron for being our ghostly reader tier contributors. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you think you might like to support the show in a more monetary fashion, come on down to Patreon. I have many tiers. I'm sure you'll find one that suits you best. I always recommend the Ghostly Reader tier, since you get a signed book anytime I write one on your doorstep. But I have many tiers, and again, I'm sure you'll find one to suit you. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.